The library card was tucked inside my left shoe. I know how that sounds. A 63-year-old woman hiding a piece of plastic in her shoe like a teenager sneaking cigarettes. But when your husband checks your coat pockets before you leave the house and asks where you're going and why and for how long and who you might see there, you learn to be creative about the things you need to keep. I'd had that library card for 31 years, since before I married Gerald, since before I became Mrs. Dorothy Ashworth, and slowly, without quite noticing, stopped being Dorothy Pelham, the woman who used to read 2 novels a week and drive herself wherever she needed to go and order whatever she wanted off a menu without calculating whether it was worth the conversation that would follow. The card was just a card, but it meant I could walk to the Millbrook Public Library on Tuesday afternoons while Gerald was at his standing poker game with the men from his old cardiology practice, and I could sit in a quiet chair by the window for 2 hours without anyone monitoring me. I could use their computer, and I could talk to the librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Frances who'd started leaving books on the hold shelf for me without my asking. She just knew. I want to tell you how I got to that point. To the shoe, to the hidden card, to the 2 hours a week that felt like oxygen, because it didn't start with cruelty. It never does. That's what makes it so hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. They want a villain in a black hat. What they get instead is a slow fog that rolls in so gradually you don't realize you can't see until you've been blind for years. Gerald retired from cardiology the spring I turned 59. 34 years of medicine, of being the most important person in every room he entered, of nurses and residents and patients all deferring to his judgment. He was good at his job. He was respected. He was the kind of man other men called brilliant and other women called distinguished, and I called my husband, which meant I knew the parts of him no one else saw, the way he needed to be right. The way he went very quiet and very still when he felt he wasn't in control, like a pressure building behind glass. I'd been a high school English teacher for 26 years. I loved it. I loved the books and the discussions and watching a 16-year-old suddenly understand what Steinbeck was doing. I retired the same year Gerald did because he asked me to. We'd finally have time together, he said. We could travel. We could do all the things we'd postponed while we were both working. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Within 6 months, I understood that what he'd meant was something different. We could finally be together on his terms, in his schedule, in the shape of life he decided we should have. It started small. He took over the finances, which he framed as taking care of me. He'd always been better with money, he said. I'd never argued with that. He set up a joint account and told me my teacher's pension would go directly into it, which was fine, practical even. Then he gave me a debit card with a weekly limit of $60, which was not fine but happened so smoothly I almost didn't notice the moment it became our arrangement. $60 a week for a retired schoolteacher in upstate New York. If you've ever bought groceries in this country in the last 4 years, you know that $60 doesn't take you far. I learned to shop at the discount grocery 2 miles away. I learned to check unit prices on everything, to buy the store brand of the store brand, to plan meals around whatever protein was marked down on Friday mornings. I stopped buying coffee when I was out because $2.50 was almost 5% of my weekly budget, and Gerald had a perfectly good coffee maker at home. I stopped having lunch with my friend Pauline, who taught history at the same school for 18 years, and called me every Saturday to catch up. Lunch meant money I didn't have. Lunch meant explaining why I didn't have it, and I couldn't explain because I didn't have language yet for what was happening to me. I just kept saying I was busy, I was tired, we should reschedule. After a while, Pauline stopped calling. He took my car. Not legally, not dramatically. He decided we only needed one vehicle, which made sense, he said, since we were both home now. He sold my Honda Civic, the one I'd owned for 11 years, and deposited the money into the joint account. When I needed to go somewhere, I could take his car. I just needed to let him know ahead of time and he would decide if it was necessary. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I was 61 years old and I needed permission to drive a car. He checked my phone every evening after dinner, the way you'd scroll through a child's device looking for inappropriate messages. He didn't hide that he was doing it. He'd just pick it up off the counter and go through it while I washed dishes, and if he found something he didn't like, a text from a former colleague, an email from Pauline, a receipt from somewhere I'd been, we would talk about it. That's what he called it. Talking about it. He would sit across from me at the kitchen table with his reading glasses on and explain, very calmly, very reasonably, why whatever I'd done was a concern. $14 on a book at the library sale. Dorothy, you have a library card. Why are we buying books? A text from my son David's wife asking if I wanted to join her for yoga. Dorothy, you've never done yoga in your life. Why are you suddenly making plans without mentioning them to me? A phone call from my sister in Tucson that lasted 40 minutes. Dorothy, if you have 40 minutes to talk on the phone, you have 40 minutes to help me with the yard. My son David lived in Portland. I hadn't seen him in 2 years because Gerald didn't want to fly, and driving across the country was out of the question, and David couldn't afford to come east, and I couldn't explain to my son why I couldn't send him money for a plane ticket because I didn't have money. That was mine. David thought I was distant. David thought I'd changed. He was right that I'd changed. He didn't know why, and I didn't know how to tell him. The breaking point was not dramatic. That's another thing people don't understand. There's rarely an explosion. There's just a Tuesday morning in November when something small becomes unbearable. I was at Hendrick's Pharmacy on Oak Street to pick up my blood pressure medication. I'd been taking it for 3 years, the same prescription, the same copay, every 30 days. Gerald managed our insurance and handled the medical bills, so I hadn't actually paid for my own medication in years. He just put it on his card when he picked it up, because going to the pharmacy was one of the errands he'd taken over without my noticing. That morning he'd sent me to pick it up because he had a former colleague coming for coffee and didn't want to leave. He gave me $22. My copay was $22, he said. That was the exact amount. Except the copay had gone up. The pharmacist, a young woman with braided hair and a name tag that said Carol, looked at me with careful eyes when I pushed the $22 across the counter. I'm sorry, ma'am. The copay is now $31. It changed with the new year. I stood there. $9. I was $9 short on my own blood pressure medication, and I had no way to get $9 because the $60 Gerald had given me on Monday was already spent on groceries, and I had no card of my own, and I couldn't call him and ask, because asking meant explaining, and explaining meant the conversation at the kitchen table. And I didn't have the energy for that conversation today. Not today, not again. I started crying right there at the pharmacy counter, not quietly. The ugly kind of crying, the kind that comes up from somewhere you've been keeping locked. Carol came around from behind the counter. She didn't say anything right away. She put her hand on my arm and waited, and there was something in the way she waited that told me she had done this before. Stood next to a woman falling apart over $9 and understood that it wasn't about $9 at all. Why don't you sit down for a minute, she said. There was a chair by the blood pressure machine and I sat in it and cried until it passed. Carol brought me a small cup of water. She sat down in the chair beside me the way someone does when they've decided they have time, regardless of the line at the counter. Is there someone I can call for you? She asked. I almost said my husband. The words were right there. Instead, I heard myself say, no. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, I've seen you in here before. Your husband usually picks this up. I nodded. Does he know you're here today? Such a simple question. Such a specific question. I looked at her and I saw that she already knew the shape of the answer. He knows, I said. But he didn't give you enough. I didn't say anything. Carol reached into her own pocket and put a folded $10 bill on the chair between us. I started to refuse. She shook her head before I could speak. Please don't, she said. I want to. Then she wrote something on the back of a pharmacy receipt and folded it once and put it in my hand. There's a women's resource center on Carver Street, about 8 blocks from here. My friend Susan works there. She's a social worker. Very good, very kind. If you ever want to talk to someone who understands this specific kind of situation, she's there Tuesdays and Thursdays. I looked at the receipt. Susan Marlowe, and a phone number. I want to tell you I called immediately. I didn't. I went home and made lunch and didn't say anything to Gerald about the extra $10 or about Carol or about Susan Marlowe on Carver Street. I put the receipt inside my copy of Middlemarch, which Gerald had never opened and never would, and I cooked chicken and rice for dinner and washed the dishes and went to bed. But I didn't throw it away. That was the difference. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't throw something away. I carried Susan Marlowe's name for 3 weeks before I used it. I turned it over in my mind at night while Gerald slept. I read it again every few days inside the pages of my book just to remind myself it existed. On a Tuesday afternoon in December, instead of sitting in the library chair by the window, I walked 8 blocks down Carver Street. The resource center was in a converted house. Blue shutters, a small sign by the door. It looked like the kind of place that was trying not to draw attention to itself, which I later understood was intentional. Susan came out to the lobby when the receptionist called her. She was in her late 40s, steady-eyed, unhurried. She brought me back to a small office with a space heater and a plant on the windowsill and 2 mugs of tea that appeared without my asking. I told her everything. It took a long time. Not because I was ashamed, though I was, but because the story was so full of ordinary moments that I kept having to stop and explain that yes, this small, unremarkable thing was in fact part of it. That yes, the combined weight of all these small, unremarkable things was what it was. When I finished, my tea was cold, and my hands were shaking slightly, and I felt lighter than I had in years. "What you're describing has a name," Susan said. "It's called coercive control. The financial abuse, the isolation, the surveillance. These are recognized patterns of domestic abuse, even without physical violence." I told her what I always expected someone to say back to me. "But he doesn't hit me. He's never hit me." "I know," she said. "That doesn't change what it is." I started seeing Susan every Tuesday. Gerald never questioned my library trips, so I kept them as cover, going to the library first, then walking to Carver Street. Francis, the librarian, who had never asked me a single direct question, somehow always had a book ready for me to check out so my trips would have something to show for them. Susan introduced me to a legal advocate named Thomas who worked pro bono with the center 2 days a week. Thomas was in his mid-30s, methodical and kind, and he explained things to me in plain language without making me feel foolish for not knowing them. "I had rights," he said, "to the marital assets, including the joint account where my pension had been deposited for 4 years, to spousal support during and after a separation, to my own Social Security benefits based on my own work record, 31 years as a teacher, which I could claim at 62 or wait until 67 for the full amount. These were mine. No one had taken them. I just hadn't known they were there. I need you to understand what it means to be told that at 63 years old, after 4 years of $60 weekly allowances, the money existed, my contributions existed. I hadn't been erased from the financial record, only from the knowledge of it. We made a plan. It took 2 months, which I know sounds long, but Susan told me that safety matters more than speed, and I was starting to believe her. First, documents. My birth certificate and Social Security card were in a locked box in Gerald's home office. My teacher's pension statements were filed in a cabinet I'd never been invited to open. I waited for a Sunday afternoon when Gerald went to his former partner's house to watch football, which ran reliably from noon until at least 6. I found what I needed in 40 minutes. I drove his car to the copy shop on Maple Avenue and made copies of everything and returned the originals before he came home. My heart was beating so hard during the drive that I kept one hand on my chest as if I could steady it from the outside. Second, money. Susan connected me with an emergency fund the center maintained for exactly this purpose, enough to cover 2 weeks of housing while the legal process began. She told me about it matter-of-factly, the way you'd tell someone about a bus route, and I was so grateful I couldn't speak for a moment. Third, a place to go. Susan knew a woman named Gloria, who owned a small rental property on the other side of town and kept 1 unit available at reduced rate for women in transition. It was a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of an old duplex. Clean, quiet, a kitchen with yellow curtains. Gloria had been through her own version of this story 15 years earlier and had never forgotten what it felt like to need somewhere safe that didn't ask too many questions. I found my escape object at the back of my closet, an old canvas tote bag I'd gotten at a teacher's conference in 2009. It had a picture of a stack of books on it and the words, "Reading changes everything." I started filling it quietly, over 3 weeks. 1 or 2 things at a time so nothing would be obviously missing. A pair of slacks, 3 sweaters, my mother's pearl earrings that Gerald didn't know I still had. The photo of David at his college graduation. A paperback copy of Middlemarch with Susan Marlowe's receipt still inside. Everything that mattered to me, truly mattered, fit in a conference tote bag. That is either very sad or very clarifying. I decided it was clarifying. Thomas filed the separation papers. They would be served to Gerald at the house, but I would not be there. We chose a Thursday. Gerald played golf on Thursday mornings, leaving at 8 and returning no earlier than 1. I had 5 hours, more than enough. Wednesday night I made dinner. Pasta with marinara, the kind he liked, with garlic bread. He talked about a former colleague's health problems and the new development going up downtown, and whether I'd remembered to buy more of his specific brand of sparkling water. I said yes. I passed him the bread. I washed the dishes. I didn't sleep. I lay next to him in the dark thinking about the apartment with yellow curtains and my son David, who didn't know yet that his mother was about to reappear in his life. I thought about 34 years of marriage, the early years before the control settled in, when we'd driven to Maine for a week every August, and I'd stayed up reading on the cottage porch, and Gerald had brought me coffee in the mornings without being asked. That man had existed. I didn't know where he'd gone, or whether he'd ever fully been real, or whether I'd simply been too in love to see him clearly. It didn't change what I had to do. Thursday morning I made him breakfast. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, the coffee exactly the way he liked it. He sat at the kitchen table reading news on his phone and complained briefly about the eggs being slightly overcooked, which they weren't. He took his golf bag from the hall closet and said he'd be home by 1. He did not kiss me. He hadn't kissed me in 2 years, at least. I watched his car pull out of the driveway. I counted to 100. Then I went upstairs and got the canvas tote bag from the back of my closet. I walked through the house once. I don't know exactly why. Not sentiment, not nostalgia, something more like witness. The kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals and calculated the price of vegetables and cried quietly over a grocery list at 10 p.m. when I was $12 over budget and didn't know what to put back. The living room where I'd stopped watching the shows I liked because Gerald found them unserious. The spare bedroom where I'd moved my books after he said the shelves in our room were cluttered. I'd spent 4 years in this house, being slowly erased, and I wanted to look at every room and say, I know what happened here. I didn't leave a note. Thomas had advised against it. Susan's colleague, a retired nurse named Beverly, was waiting outside in a green Subaru. She was 68 and had bright white hair and a no-nonsense quality that made me trust her immediately. She put my bag in her trunk like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Ready? She said. Yes, I said. And I didn't look back once. Gloria's apartment smelled like lemon cleaner and old wood. She met me at the door and showed me upstairs without ceremony, the way a person does when they've done this enough times to understand that explanations can wait, and what someone needs first is simply to be inside and safe. The bedroom window looked out on a maple tree, bare in December but solid, the kind of tree that had been there longer than any of the problems that had led me here. I sat on the edge of the bed and called David. He picked up on the second ring, surprised to hear from me on a weekday morning, his voice immediately concerned because it had been 3 months since we'd spoken for more than 10 minutes and he'd learned, without my telling him, to read something in my brevity. Mom, are you okay? I'm okay, I said. I'm more okay than I've been in a long time. But I have some things to tell you, he cried. I hadn't expected that. My adult son, 31 years old, sitting in his apartment in Portland, crying on the phone while I told him the parts of the last 4 years I'd hidden from him. He said he'd noticed things. He said he'd asked Gerald once, 2 years ago, if everything was all right at home, and Gerald had said I was struggling with the transition to retirement and he was managing the situation. He said he'd wanted to come and I'd kept telling him the timing wasn't right. I know, I said. I'm sorry. I'm asking you now. Can you come? He booked a flight that afternoon. Gerald came home to an empty house and a set of separation papers delivered by a Millbrook County deputy sheriff. According to Thomas, he called the cell phone I'd left behind 62 times over the following 2 days. He called the resource center and left messages that Susan described as alternating between fury and confusion. He called David, who did not answer. He called Gerald's own sister, who had always been more sympathetic to me than to her brother, and who called Susan to confirm I was safe and told her she'd seen this coming for years. He told anyone who would listen that I'd had some kind of breakdown, that I'd been confused, that someone had manipulated me into this, that his wife of 34 years would never make a decision like this on her own, which tells you everything you need to know about what he thought of me, even after all those years. The legal process took 7 months. Gerald's attorney tried to characterize my departure as abandonment. Thomas had documentation for every year of the financial control, every account statement, every record of the $60 weekly allowance deposited against my incoming pension, every piece of evidence that what had happened in that house had a name and a legal framework and consequences. Thomas was young and methodical, and he never raised his voice, and he was very quietly devastating in that courtroom. Judge Patricia Alcott was in her late 50s. She had a reputation in the county courthouse for not being impressed by men who confused authority with entitlement. She was not impressed by Gerald. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in July, 11 months after I'd walked out the front door. I received half of everything. The retirement accounts Gerald had managed in his name alone. The investment portfolio I hadn't known existed until Thomas found it in the financial disclosure process. The equity in the house, which Gerald sold rather than refinance, which meant a check that arrived on a Wednesday morning and which I sat with for a long time before depositing, because it was the first substantial money I'd held that was entirely mine in nearly 5 years. I received spousal support of $3,500 a month until my Social Security benefits reached their full amount at $67. Thomas had also helped me ensure my own benefits were calculated correctly. 31 years of teaching, a work record that Gerald's control had not erased even when it had erased almost everything else. I stayed in Gloria's apartment for 8 months before I found my own place, a small house with a yard 15 minutes from David's flight path and 40 minutes from Pauline, who'd answered my call on the first try and cried and didn't ask me to explain anything, just said, "When can I see you? And I'll drive there if it's easier." I planted a garden that first summer. Tomatoes, herbs, a climbing rose against the back fence that the previous tenant had started and I decided to keep. I went back to reading 2 novels a week. I joined a book club at the Millbrook Library, which is how I came to see Francis regularly, who had known all along something was wrong and had never once said so directly, just quietly kept leaving books on the hold shelf that seemed precisely chosen for where I was. David flew out in October, the first October in 5 years that I'd spent with my son. We drove to the farmer's market on Saturday morning and he bought me coffee without my calculating whether it was worth it, and we walked around for 2 hours just talking about books and his work and the neighborhood and nothing important. And everything important. The way you can only talk with someone when you have nothing to hide. Gerald sent an email in September, 3 months after the divorce was final. He said he'd been seeing a therapist. He said he understood now that some of his behaviors had been harmful, which I believed, though I noticed that he described them as behaviors rather than choices. He said he hoped I was well. I read it twice and forwarded it to Thomas in case it was relevant legally. It wasn't. I didn't respond. There's a Tuesday morning volunteer shift at the resource center now, 9 to noon, which I've been doing since February. Susan trained me herself. I sit in the small office with the space heater and the plant on the windowsill, and I make tea for women who come in not quite sure what to call what's happening to them, who say things like, "He doesn't hit me, he's never hit me," as if that's the bar. As if the only kind of harm that counts is the kind that leaves visible marks. I tell them what Susan told me. I tell them there are words for what they're experiencing. Legal words, financial words, and those words have power. I tell them about Social Security and pension rights and the things that belong to them that no one can take as long as they know to look for them. I tell them it won't be easy, and it won't be fast, and there will be days when the fear is bigger than the hope. And I tell them that 63 is not too old, that 65 is not too old, that whatever age they are sitting in that chair, they are not too late. Last Tuesday, a woman came in, maybe late 50s, wearing a good coat that had seen better years. She had the look I recognized, careful, contained, a person who had learned to take up very little space. She sat down across from me and folded her hands in her lap. "I'm not sure I'm in the right place," she said. I handed her a mug of tea and sat back, unhurried. "Tell me what's been happening," I said. "The canvas tote bag is in my closet now. Unpacked. Nothing in it but a folded piece of paper with Susan Marlowe's phone number on the back of a pharmacy receipt. I keep it there on purpose. Not as a reminder of how bad things were, but as proof that I carried what I needed when I needed it and I found my way to the door. I used to think that survival was the goal. I understand now that survival is only the beginning. The goal is the Tuesday morning when you wake up in your own house, make your own coffee, drive your own car to a place where someone needs what you know, and you give it freely because someone gave it to you once and that's how it works. That's how it has always worked. That chain of women passing resources and courage from hand to hand across the distance between despair and the door. I'm 64 years old and I finally understand what my own life is for. It took losing it almost entirely to see it clearly. But I see it now. And I am not going to look away.